Hey fans, it's the VC Critiquer. I know I haven't posted much in a while, I haven't been in a zombie state or anything, just super busy with personal life and stuff, but I wanted to make it up to you guys by giving you a very special kind of review today. I'll tell you why in just a little bit. But first, speaking of zombies, who doesn't love a good zombie flick?
No, I'm not talking about the mindless zombies that the world will turn into if we let AI take over completely. I'm talking about those flesh-eating ghoul-like creatures that have been rampaging through horror films for years in the dramatic sense, like in The Dead Don't Die, The Last of Us. Though I'll be frank, Bella Ramsey just doesn't have the same charm with an American accent as with a British one. Or in the more comedic sense, like with Zombieland, Shaun of the Dead, or Cooties. Hey, that last movie wasn't so bad, give it another try. But we must never forget the father of zombie works. A man whose work made for the very first zombie film ever in the form of a low-budget B-movie that would pave the way for these abominations to devour humankind in the most brutal way one could imagine. The demented mind I'm of course talking about is Richard Mattheson, the film adaptation of his novella I Am Legend that made for the first zombie film, The Last Man on Earth.
What, you guys thought I was talking about George Romero in Night of the Living Dead? Well, despite zombies technically being referred to as vampires, Richard Matheson's I Am Legend is technically considered the first true zombie apocalypse story.
This story revolves around a government scientist named Robert Neville, who's currently been living in a post-apocalyptic world for about 3 years now, after a freak accident that differs in all three film versions kills a good chunk of the world's population, including his wife and daughter, and turns what appears to be the rest of it into these zombie vampire things that, well, they're mutant, bottom line, and he's seemingly the last normal person on Earth, and at this point he's more or less adjusted to it, even if he does at times resort to talking to mannequins to settle his loneliness, with finding resources to survive pretty much being the equivalent of going out shopping, and by now to him the threat of these zombies is little more than the threat of a mugger. But after some exposition, survival, and dicking around a bit, he finds that he's actually not quite the very last human on Earth. There are a few others, most notably this chick who wants him to be the Rick Grimes of her Walking Dead resistance. And whereas in the original book the hero survives, more info on that later, all three film adaptations end with our hero dying, but not without contributing a major step in a cure for the zombies. Such is the premise of the first true zombie survivor story, adapted 3 times by Hollywood, but the first 2 times under the new titles of The Last Man on Earth and Omega Man respectively, with the most recent adaptation retaining the original title of I Am Legend. While that version is pretty popular and even has a sequel coming soon, I bet a lot of you are surprised that not only was Will Smith's arguably best known film based on a book, but it was actually the third film based on said book. But it's not hard to see why this is the best known one. Yeah, all 3 film versions have their strengths, but I gotta go with the crowd on this one and say that my favorite version of the story is Will Smith's. But the reasons go well beyond it just being the most popular, and again, there are some things I feel the other 2 movies did better, so why don't we load up our machine guns so I can elaborate on that. This is oldest versus median versus newest, The Last Man on Earth versus Omega Man versus I Am Legend.
We've had a lot of great zombie apocalypse survivors over the years, haven't we? Rick Grimes, Sean Riley, Ben, Nigel Uno, and more. But today we're going to be looking at the founding father of zombie apocalypse survivors, Mr. Robert Neville himself. So which debut of this popular character archetype leaves the biggest impact? Let's find out with Best Robert Neville.
Our hero Robert Neville, or Robert Morgan in the oldest, is respectively played by Vincent Price, Charlton Heston, and Will Smith. While he's definitely no Rick Grimes or Ash Williams, Robert Neville is pretty damn resourceful towards life as the supposed last man on Earth in a world filled with abominations that want to devour him regularly. Yeah, I'd think with 3 years of solitude, he'd be pretty bitter about the circumstances, especially since he lost his family from this ordeal, or at the very least be completely batshit insane from isolation. And yes, he does dearly miss his wife and daughter, and it's not to say he's completely in his right mind. I mean, he's having freaking conversations with mannequins like they're lifelong buds. But overall, it's clear he's trying to make the best of this whole ordeal. But of course, we have to ask which one is the best. Let's look at Vincent Price's portrayal first. Now, for non-movie buffs, Vincent Price was essentially the Tim Curry of the golden age of Hollywood, typically placing sleazy, despicable, but also delightfully hammy characters, especially horror movie villains. So naturally, I was pretty interested to see what he'd be like as a monster fighter rather than the monster himself. I mean, the dude's almost as naturally intimidating as these zombies are, so he seemed like a worthy opponent, but I was pretty disappointed to find that Price's Robert was just kind of an everyman here. Why don't I start with the good parts of his portrayal first? I mean, I do admit, Vincent Price's natural smug intimidation does help with his somewhat underwhelming dialogue, especially during his vocal monologues as the supposed last man on Earth.
Is that all it has been since I inherited the world? Only 3 years. Seems like 100 million. I can't afford the luxury of anger. Anger can make me vulnerable. It can destroy my reason, and reason's the only advantage I have over them.
And believe it or not, despite typically known for playing bad guys, Vincent Price actually completely nails the emotional scenes of the character, especially during a scene where he's watching home movies of his family, a relatively new feature for the 1960s, and he starts enjoying the nostalgia, to maniacally laughing, to flat out freaking bawling over having lost everyone he's loved in his life. More info on that a bit later. Also, regarding the female chick who comes in the third act, I feel that Price was the kindest upon first meeting her, where Heston and Smith took a little bit more time to warm up to her. But that said, again, I'm sorry to speak unhighly of the golden age Hollywood Tim Curry, but I still just didn't find Price's character all that interesting of an apocalypse survivor. I think it goes without saying that it's not nearly as exciting to see him fight off these vampire zombie things with a hammer and stake instead of with a machine gun, traditional or not. But on top of that, he doesn't seem to be making the best of being the supposed last man on Earth like Heston or Smith. Heston took residence in a luxurious military mansion, living in the lap of luxury, well, as much in the lap of luxury as you can for an apocalyptic world, and gets to enjoy a private screening of his favorite movie each day, even if it's the same damn thing over and over.
No, they sure don't make pictures like that anymore.
Smith, meanwhile, plays golf on the wing of an Air Force plane, fishes in the water tank at the aquarium, and turns his living room into a private workout facility. Price spends his free time sitting at home drinking tea. Hell, he doesn't even talk to mannequins like in the other two versions. And this is just my opinion, but I didn't feel he was really much of a badass against the zombies either. I'm not saying that he doesn't have good reason to be scared, but almost every time he goes up against them, he looks like he's about to shit his pants. So yeah, not the ideal zombie fighter. But those heartfelt moments he had did still make a difference in the long run, and unfortunately, this is where Charlton Heston falls short. The biggest issue I have with him is, unlike Price or Smith, Heston never had a family that he lost to the zombie pandemic. At least none that we know of, nor a dog that he loses shortly before our hero meets the female lead. So the lack of grieving scenes do somewhat hamper the drama of the story. Smith not only had a family, but he clearly missed them every bit as much as Price missed his. Hell, we see him try and continue to live out his role as father to his dog Sam.
No. Eat your vegetables. Don't just push them around. Eat them. I'm not playing. Okay. You're gonna eat your vegetables. You'll sit down here all night.
What are you whining about? Why don't you just eat your vegetables? Hey, all right, here's the deal. Look. I'm gonna eat twice as many vegetables tomorrow night. All right?
Yes, that's adorable, but still really sad, and you can tell this dude misses his daughter a lot. Now, I'm not saying that Heston's Robert was a jerk or anything. No, he easily has the best bond with the female lead, and he's fairly nice to the other survivors he encounters, even helping save the life of the female lead's son. But Smith just went a little more above and beyond, like taking the female lead's son to his late daughter's bedroom when he falls asleep. So I think you guys see where this is going, where Price had the heartfelt emotion and Heston had the charismatic action movie hero vibe. Smith not only had both, but I also feel he pulled both off the best. As Ash Williams-esque as Charlton Heston was, Will Smith at times felt like he could take on both Heston and Williams with just one hand. Just ask Chris Rock. That's how much of an action badass this dude is. You can definitely see why he's been able to survive in such a dangerous world for over 3 years. Or as sad as Vincent Price is when his canine companion kicks the bucket, you can tell it hit Will Smith a lot more.
Don't worry about a thing, 'cause every little thing is gonna be alright.
Funny, I kind of figured Smith wasn't a fan of that song. It's also evident that the loss of his family has really hampered not only his faith in humanity, but also in God himself.
Every single person that you or I has ever known is dead! Dead! There is no God. There is no God.
When you hear how this dude lost his family in this version, you'll understand why he has such a downer mindset. So for best capturing the heartfelt emotion and action movie badassery of the character, Will Smith makes it the best portrayal of the first zombie apocalypse survivor.
Point goes to I Am Legend.
Look, you're ill. You ought to see a doctor.
You're full of crap.
Dun, 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 can't touch this. Dun, 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 can't touch this.
Hey, you're still not out of the water for the Oscars yet, Smith.
But of course, a zombie apocalypse survivor is only as good as the zombies themselves. Mutants, or vampires, or Gollum rejected CGI models. You know what, screw it. They look like zombies, act mostly like zombies, and this is a zombie apocalypse scenario. As far as I'm concerned, they're zombies. So which depiction, the first incarnation of these pop culture abominations, is the most threatening and memorable, if not necessarily scary, which you'll soon see in a bit? Let's find out with Best Zombies!
Out of all the different portrayals of the characters in each version, the zombies is probably the one that differs the most. So let's start with the ones I like the least, which, as you may have already guessed, is an I Am Legend. Yeah, the vast majority of filmgoers seem to agree that this version's biggest flaw is the zombies itself. And unfortunately, I gotta go with the crowd on this one. I will admit that it's kind of neat that animals are also vulnerable to the zombification in this version, which is relatively uncommon in zombie works, and this ultimately is why Robert has to pull an old Yeller on his canine companion. But first of all, the CGI used for them is pretty laughably bad, not just with the textures that look like Call of Duty prototype models at best, but also with their expressions. Yeah, 3/4 of the time, these things look more like they're pleasing themselves with necrophilia videos on Pornhub instead of like they want to devour you as slowly and painfully as possible. And just for the record, this movie had a freaking $150 million budget. Though looking at Food Fight, I guess big budgets don't always guarantee high quality CGI. But I also feel that the zombies are a bit too animal-like in this version, not just in their behavior, but also in how they look. I feel part of what makes zombies scary is knowing that they used to be normal, healthy people like you or I. But here, the zombies look nothing like their former selves and instead look like Gollum and Hellboy hybrids. So it ironically makes them less freaky because it doesn't remind us as much that these used to be humans themselves, and impossible for Robert to feel any pain of seeing his loved ones in this form because as zombies, they're all indistinguishable from one another. So how would he be able to tell if it was a loved one? Well, I guess they do pull that with his dog, but I mean, he was in the room when she turned. The zombie mutants in The Last Man on Earth and Omega Man are miles better, not only because it's easy to tell that they used to be human, but they're actually not as thick as bricks as most zombies are. They seem to have all their basic human memories, and those who knew Robert as humans still remember him as flesh eaters as well as where he lives, and are able to follow him to his house whenever he escapes their clutches, and also have more strategized plans to break into his house and finish him off. But with that said, these portrayals are still vastly different. Whereas in The Last Man on Earth the zombies are only averagely above the intelligence normal zombies, the zombies in Omega Man are actually depicted as still completely intelligent and self-aware as they were as humans, and who operate just like a cult who actually has a clear motive for wanting to rid the world of all remaining humans, rather than just out of feral instincts. See, in this version, it was ultimately warfare that led to the apocalypse. Basically, the Soviet Union launched warheads containing a virus into the state so that we wouldn't interfere with their war with China. Here's hoping Putin doesn't get inspired by this version. And the virus ultimately had an even more detrimental effect than they had anticipated. So anyway, the zombies reveal that since it was humankind and their evil modern technology that destroyed the world, the goal of their cult is to wipe out every living trace of both of them to ensure that something like this will never happen again. And this is why they've had trouble capturing Robert, since their refusal to use modern technology makes him harder to capture. And I gotta say, that actually is a relatively interesting and understandable motive. I mean, modern technology did ultimately lead to the apocalypse and turn them into these Mr. Freeze knockoff mutants, so... On top of that, Anthony Zerb does give a pretty fun performance as the sleazy cult leader Matthias.
Oh yes, he sent you to offer us something from his world, to change us back to the creatures we were. A trick! A trick!
You've been trying to kill me for 2 years.
Last night you killed how many? 3 of us? And today we don't know yet. You're the angel of death, Doctor, not us.
Quick note, remember that last line for later in the review. Plus, in a cruel irony, he also happens to be the news reporter giving the world a scoop on the zombie pandemic. Kind of ironic how the one warning us of this threat eventually became the head of the threat itself. Now, if you're wondering about Robert's loved ones who wind up in the state, those are going to be for upcoming rounds. I know that's somewhat ironic that I favored the least zombie-like depictions in this adaptation, the first zombie work ever, but nonetheless, it is still really damn cool to see zombies with a motive other than mindless savagery. Only other time I think I've seen that is with the senior citizen zombies in Kids Next Door. Plus, giving them full-on human intelligence does make them all the more dangerous. Even if it is harder for them to capture Robert since they refuse to use modern technology, they are not harmless by any means, and Robert still has to stay on his toes at all times to avoid them. And to their credit, they do succeed in capturing Robert at around the middle and come very close to killing him off, only failing because the female lead was there to save him. And yes, they are the ones responsible for killing Robert in this version. I'll talk more about his death in the other two films later. So all things considered, I guess the most non-traditional depiction of the zombies makes for the best one here.
Point goes to Omega Man.
Get him!
Okay, so let's see who's next on our zombie cliche list. Badass action hero, check. Zombies themselves, check. Oh, looks like it's time for the female lead, who, as I'm sure you know in these kinds of movies, range from useless whiny wusses to badass action girls who can knock out 10 zombies with just one fist. And funny enough, that's kind of how the three depictions of our heroine range in this film. So which one was the most feminist? Sorry, I mean most badass. Let's find out with Best Female Lead.
You'll note that I didn't use the term love interest because only one of these versions is this to Robert, and in a perfect world, that would be an I Am Legend, which would allow the most popular version of the story to win in a more organic way. But unfortunately, that is not the case, so I have to use less orthodox methods to ensure my favorite version wins. But now that I've established that the most popular version is going to win, my favorite version of the female lead is actually Lisa in the median, not only because she's the only one who Robert actually forms a legit relationship with, but we actually get one of the first interracial kisses ever in film history, though not quite the first one ever, contrary to what Whoopi Goldberg said. But it's not my woke biasing that makes her my favorite. No, she honestly has a great personality, not just with all her fun one-liners.
As a matter of fact, I was going to apply to BioWar Labs for my postdoc, but the next turn never came.
I'm sorry you didn't make it.
Sorry the world didn't make it.
Christ, you could save the world.
Screw the world. Let's save Richie.
But she honestly may be even more of a badass than Heston or even Smith was. After she saves him from the zombies, she makes it clear that he has to earn her trust, and until then, there's no Miss Nice Girl from her.
And if you just have to play James Bond, I'll bust your ass.
Again, like with Will Smith, it's not hard to see why she's survived in such a dangerous world for over 3 years. But badass and feisty persona aside, she is a very sweet person when you get to know her, and especially when you get on her good side. And it's clear she's worried sick about her son, and really is hoping that Robert's blood can be the answer to her seemingly unheard prayers. Oh yeah, something I forgot to mention is, part of why Robert's been able to survive for so long is that he's discovered through blood tests that he has an immunity to the disease. How is this possible? The only version that really explains this is the oldest, where Robert theorizes that a bat bite he got once helped him build up an immunity to the vampirification. Meh, better than nothing. And in all three versions, Robert hopes that his blood can be used as a vaccine to treat the victims of the plague, and even better may be the zombies themselves. And he gives some of his blood to help a person, but it's a different person in each film, in this version it being her son. And it takes a little while, but it does work eventually, and the moment it does, these two are peas in a pod who honestly have such a cute connection with each other. You know, this may have been why they dropped Robert's family in this version. The romance between these two is so awesome, the writers may have felt that Robert would have looked like a jerk for falling for a whole nother woman so intensely. I still think they should have kept the family though. The newest one, Anna, is still pretty likable though, even if she's not as much of a badass as Lisa, although she does rescue Robert from the zombies in this version as well when the two first properly meet, not to mention makes him breakfast when he regains consciousness the next day. but she's likable because of how much of an optimist she is. Yeah, for a zombie apocalypse survivor, she still has quite a good outlook on the situation, and it's not in a way that feels overly sweet and not believable. She makes it clear that she still has faith that God is still with her through all this crazy shit that's happened, and once Robert comes back with her to that safe zone, the prayers of she and the other survivors will be answered.
Something told me to turn on the radio. Something told me to come here. Neville, the world is quieter now. You just have to listen. If we listen, we can hear God's plan.
And she's clearly just as protective of her son as Lisa was with hers. What about the one the oldest called Ruth? Well, even though the actress gives a great performance, Ruth's just kind of a sulky, whiny, entitled wuss.
Unable to sleep. Then you shout at me. You chased me across a field, hit me, dragged me to this house.
Yeah, while it was hinted that there might have been feelings starting to develop between she and Robert in the newest, and there just wasn't time for them to expand on it, here, there's clearly no romantic connection between the two whatsoever. They're just amicable acquaintances, and that's all they ever will be. But what really sells it for me with Lisa is she becomes a zombie herself in her version, and it's pretty hard for Robert to see her like this. Yeah, she does get back to normal at the end, but sadly, Robert does not live to see it. Again, I have a plan to ensure that I Am Legend will win despite the supposed tie between it and this version, but lying about my honest opinion is not a method I'm willing to stoop to. Even though Anna was very sweet and 1,000 times better than Ruth and the oldest, Lisa was not only very good-hearted, but also just as tough of a zombie fighter as Robert, and was the only one to form a true legit love relationship with him, in one of the earliest film depictions of interracial lovers no less, and that's point-worthy to me.
Point goes to Omega Man.
The world is quieter now.
But of course, a male and female lead can't ward off a whole zombie apocalypse all by themselves. They just have to do most of it in this case, since, as I'm sure most of you already know, side characters typically wind up dead by the end in zombie movies. Hell, a lot of them are already dead at the start of the story in this case, but that doesn't mean they weren't supportive to Robert in other ways. So let's see who was more supportive with Best Supporting Cast.
None of these versions really have that strong a supporting cast, but they are still very different in each version. And if you're a Vincent Price fan, take comfort in the fact that his version of the story is the one I'm giving the point here. Why? Well, why don't we dive right into it? Omega Man really just has the other survivors that I mentioned earlier, who only show up at the end of the oldest and newest. Again, more info on that later. Well, I take it back, the female lead son has a decent amount of screen time in the median and newest. He's cut altogether from the oldest. But he doesn't have much personality aside from being the damsel, or rather, damseler, kid in distress. Well, I take that back also. The median one did bravely try to talk sense into the zombies, having them accept Robert's vaccine for them. It goes about as well as you'd expect, but that was still a pretty noble gesture. But as for the rest of the survivors, they really don't have much to offer. And a huge disadvantage it has is that it completely drops Robert's wife and daughter they lost at the beginning of the pandemic, and the dog they lost not long before meeting the female lead. And that sucks because both of their losses were pretty tragic in both movies, but were still fairly different. Why don't we look at Smith's backstory first? Here, we get a montage in pieces throughout the first half of the film, kind of like what they were planning to do with Marlin's backstory in Finding Nemo originally. Here, Robert desperately tries to get his wife and daughter onto an evacuation helicopter with a big quarantine on Manhattan fast approaching. He's not going with them because he's in the military and he's gotta try and fight the bastards. And it's relatively short, with all the pieces put together that is, but it's still really well done. From his daughter whining about how they left her Christmas presents behind when he's trying to focus, to Robert's wife almost being denied boarding due to a missed scan of the zombie detector, which Robert thankfully orders him to redo to get an accurate result, and Robert having a very emotional goodbye with his family, with his daughter asking them to watch their puppy through all this. But unfortunately, another emergency evacuation helicopter nearby goes haywire, and...
That's a cruel irony.
One thing I love about this is, the split second before we actually see the crash, it cuts to Robert waking up the next day. It's a great case of leaving it to the imagination to make it all the more disturbing, i.e. less is more. So talk about sad, huh? But a huge advantage the oldest has is that it gives us a much more in-depth look at how the zombie pandemic came into fruition than the other two films, even showing us what Robert's life was like before it even began, something we never got in the median or newest, and he seemed like an extremely happy family man with good friends, and yeah, their chemistry is freaking adorable.
Hey, Mommy! When are you gonna cut the cake?
Right now, our problem is to cut that cake.
But of course, rumors started spreading that this dangerous plague from Europe could be spreading through the winds. Robert's skeptical, until the plague starts impacting hundreds of people around him, including his own daughter, and his friends / co-workers adamant on the fact that this disease could very well be turning people into zombies. Sorry, I mean vampires, since they're showing all the signs associated with such, most notably fear of sunlight. Being a man of science, Robert's basically like, yeah bud, lay off on the Universal horror films, except for the ones with Vincent Price. But as the plague worsens and the zombie apocalypse becomes more apparent, Robert insists they can't report their daughter's worsening illness to anyone for fear that the government will send a zombie squad to blow her brains out. And just look at this kid's acting.
Mommy, help me. Mommy. Mommy, please help me.
And of course, as devastating as the tragically ironic death was in the newest, I think anyone would agree that seeing their child die with that look on their face is so much more gut-wrenching. And the plague of course goes from bad to worse, with Robert's friend can't help but saying, "I told you so," and his boss trying to stay optimistic that they can find a cure, but clearly isn't too hopeful. Oh, but wait, get this. Robert tracks down the military truck that took his daughter's corpse and tries desperately to stop the soldiers from frying it, but they pretty much say piss off and proceed with the barbecue, and Robert comes home to find his beloved wife dead. This is another great less is more instance. Did she die from the plague, or did she commit suicide over the grief of her daughter's loss? Either way, Robert is not going to let his spouse suffer the same undignified death of his kid, so he buries her corpse with expected results. But now we know what Stephen King's inspiration for the end of Pet Sematary was. You'll note how I didn't include these shots of Robert's face during my mentioning of how he was a pansy in this version. This is because that's how literally anyone would react in this scenario, even if they had infinite testosterone. What about the dog? Well, it's also kinda tough. The one in the newest Sam may have a lot more screen time and the advantage of being connected with Robert before the pandemic hit, but I like how Robert actually has to win over the trust of the one the oldest, and I feel that introducing her later in the game is more effective since Robert's probably been starving for a companion by now as much as the zombies are starving for his flesh. And even if the death scene is not quite as tragic as the newest, it's still pretty well done. Oh, and remember Robert's friend who warned him about what was to come? He ironically becomes the most prominent zombie in the film, and that cruel twist, plus giving the most amount of depth to his loved ones, makes their demises all the more sad, thus earning them the point on this round. Though I do wish the oldest had kept the female lead son.
Point goes to the last man on Earth.
You're hostile.
This isn't up to you. You can't.
And now, ladies and gentlemen, we've reached the hive of this zombie horde. Which version, newest, best told the story of Will Smith version, the very first zombie apocalypse work, 2007 film, based on Richard Matheson's classic novella, I Am Legend. Here's a hint, I Am Legend. This is Story for the Win.
Now I know what most of you are probably waiting for me to get to with the story, but for those of you not familiar with, well, certain director's cut, shall we say, we're going to start off with the final cut of each version. What could have been is for later. While the very basic story is the same in all three movies, they're executed in fairly different ways. In terms of which one was most faithful to Matheson's work, that for the most part would definitely be the oldest film, The Last Man on Earth, but as I've said too many times on my show to count, more faithful to the source material doesn't always mean better, And unfortunately, that is definitely the case here. See, since this was the beginning of the zombie apocalypse survivor genre, it hadn't yet established quite enough of what would make it so popular. Yeah, like I've said before, fighting off undead abominations with a hammer and stake isn't nearly as exciting as fighting them off with a machine gun, and unfortunately, most of the action scenes in the oldest seem to amount to this and just wrestling with the zombies and using a mirror since they're technically vampires. But even then, isn't the deal with vampires and mirrors just that they can't see their reflection in mirrors? How's that supposed to harm them? Yeah, even for the time, the writing was a little, well, confused, shall we say? Yeah, as much as I love Richard Mattheson, like I've said in the past, his adaptations have tended to improve what he wrote. Like in this version and in the original novel, it's just a virus that's zombifying the world. We don't know where it came from or even why it turns people into zombies. All we know is that it's a disease. That's pretty boring, to be honest. And while the idea of nuclear warfare being what caused the plague of the median is definitely better, it's still relatively cliched. I mean, how many films have we not already seen where the zombie or monster was the result of warfare? The newest film is definitely more creative, where it keeps the idea of it being a virus that zombifies most of the population, but with an interesting twist. We learned that an ambitious middle-aged scientist named Dr. Alice Crippen, played by Emma Thompson, supposedly discovered a way to genetically re-engineer the measles to cure cancer, and at first it seemed to work like a charm. But it was discovered after 10,009 people had received the vaccine that it actually either killed its recipients or turned them into zombies. Now, isn't that so much more creative? A supposedly freaking cure for cancer ended up essentially spelling out doomsday for the world. Also, how could you possibly re-engineer the measles in such an embarrassingly botched way? The irony of this scenario may be tragic, but it's also freaking hilarious here. The news not only expands on this, but also makes the action scenes so much more engaging. Speaking of action, that's kind of an issue I have with Omega Man. Although the action scenes are much better there than in The Last Man on Earth, there's surprisingly not that many of them. While I love the multiple different ways it expands on the story here, like giving the zombies an actual cult-like motive instead of just savagery, having Robert actually get to go to the safe zone in this version, and most notably, having him form a romance with the female lead. But there's relatively few scenes with the machine gun or even legit peril, and unfortunately, that's a no-can-do for a zombie film in my book. And these kinds of films, you need at least 50% of it blasting these creatures' brains out with machine guns or even just battling dangers in general, and this film has about 20 to 25% of that, maybe? Even if the action scenes in Last Man on Earth left something to be desired, there's still a decent amount of them, plus a sense of peril. It really does suck. Because had the action scenes been just as many as good in Omega Man, I might have given the story point to that version, even if it was against the crowd's popular opinion. The expansion really was that good. But I'm sorry, you simply can't do a zombie film with this few scenes of action and peril. And like I've said before, the newest version ups the emotional scenes to the max as well. Like if that scene where Robert is singing "Every Little Thing Is Gonna Be Alright" to his dying dog / single solitary companion and the world doesn't have you bawling, I don't think anything will. Hell, just look how Robert dies in this version. Whereas in the oldest he's outright murdered by the other members of the safe zone for, I think, fear that Robert might kill those of them who might potentially be infected. I don't really get it either. Or in the median, he's killed by the zombies themselves. In the newest, he outright sacrifices himself by blowing him and the zombies attacking him up with a grenade, which allows Anna to get the cure to the folks in the safe zone and hopefully save the day. A bit cliche, but admirable nonetheless. Okay, so what's my big plan to ensure the newest version is victorious? Well, I'm not going to do what I did with my Murder on the Orient Express review and give the victory on account of it winning the best story round. No, I can't do that again, that's just too biased. No, I thought of a way that's much more fair and square. Like I said before, while none of these adaptations keep the original book's ending, the newest version intended to, or at least Robert's realization from it, before it was scrapped after negative test screenings. And it could very well be the most famous alternate ending in film history, that or Little Shop of Horrors. Either way, it's definitely, well, legendary. So the zombies are banging against the glass like in the final cut, seemingly to tear him to shreds, but one of them makes a butterfly-like drawing in the glass froth, and Robert remembers that the test zombie he's been experimenting on also has a butterfly-shaped tattoo, and then the epiphany of epiphanies hits him harder than he hit Chris Rock at the Oscars. Sorry, I couldn't resist. He realizes that the zombies are actually here to rescue their friend, and to them, he's the monster. And he kind of is in actuality. I mean, he did essentially kidnap her and use her as a lab rat. Basically, he is indeed a legend to the zombies, but not in the good way. So, he knows he has to set things right and sets the female zombie free. The zombie after him gives him an approving look, and he and his herd depart. In guilt, Robert decides to go back with Anna to the safe zone after all, and let these creatures live in peace. And all this leaves one question that we'll never know the answer to. What tasteless morons did they get to do the test screening of this movie? Seriously, what other zombie story has ever basically said, hey, let's look at things from their perspective for a change? Doesn't that just rack your brain with a shit ton of moral and ethical questions to consider now? And no, Matthias flat out spelling this for Robert in the median doesn't count because 1, it's not as impressive he didn't figure it out on his own, and 2, Robert basically brushes it off and doesn't take it to heart at all. It's pretty impressive how Robert was able to figure this out with the least sentient depiction of the zombies. Now that's what I call an ending. But the ending they settled for was still decent in my opinion, and a much more dignified death for Robert than in the other two versions. And again, it overall had the best action, emotion, and creativity with its story. And on account of that, and having arguably the greatest and most thought-provoking alternate ending in movie history, I'm giving it double points for the story round, thus securing its very rightful place as the winner.
Point and victory go to I Am Legend, the best depiction of the very first zombie apocalypse survivor story.
You are discarded.
Dan, 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 can't touch this. Dan, 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 can't touch this.
Hey, come on guys, it's not like there's many funnier scenes in that movie.